Okay, welcome back to part 2 of chapter 6, police discretion and dilemmas. And again, this is going to be part 2, and we're going to be talking about police shootings of blacks. So the killings of Eric Garner, Walter Scott, and most recently George Floyd have reinforced the perception that black men are unfairly and needlessly killed by police officers. Now, statistics, seriously, depending upon the source, because they are skewed often for whatever interest group is skewing them, okay? So you really have to look at where you get your stats at. But statistics, depending upon the source, indicate black men are disproportionately the victims of police shootings. In one Washington Post analysis, blacks were shot 2.5 times the rate of whites. Okay, and then I have a link to that actual Washington Post database if you would like to look at it a little bit further. Okay, so we'll kind of keep going. And just kind of interestingly enough, here is a chart that show people shot to death by U.S. police by race from 2017 annually through 2021. And the statistics were gleaned from a website called Statista, which actually is the same website that the Washington Post used to gather its data. So you look at the numbers and let's kind of continue on. Now, of course, shootings are not randomly distributed across the population. Okay, the explanation that blacks are shot more often because they are disproportionately involved in violent crime, or that they are disproportionately more likely to assault officers, both true to a small or somewhat extent. Now, police shootings are more likely to occur in certain areas of the city, and these areas tend to be more minority neighborhoods. Thus, it may be that both whites and blacks are equally likely to be the target of police shootings if they lived in the same high crime areas. Okay? It is possible that police officers are more likely to perceive blacks as a greater threat, even controlling for other elements in that particular situation, etc. Now, laboratory findings are kind of mixed. Some research shows that police officers participating in what they call a shoot, don't shoot scenario on a simulator or even live, kind of like a scenario-based type activity, were slower to shoot when the suspect was black than when the suspect was white. Okay, so kind of an interesting thought. And these results indicate academically that police are aware of and compensate for bias. So even police officers can control cognitive biases in a laboratory settings. Findings also show that cognitive control is impeded by some things, right? Maybe fatigue or fear, high anxiety, high arousal. Thus, their actions might be different on the street because of those different things, right? So again, those things that impede those officers' cognitive thinking, etc. So very, very interesting. Now, to understand whether there is racial bias in officers' decisions to shoot, it really is important that we have all the facts, right? Unfortunately, we do not have accurate national statistics. Police departments are not required to report shootings to any central database. It is very important to have a base number of all shootings before we can understand the factors that affect a decision to shoot. And actually, more importantly, it would be even more beneficial to have data regarding all the situations where an officer might have been, was legally allowed to shoot and did not. Now, again, unfortunately, this type of data will never be available. That's why researchers use the shoot, don't shoot type scenarios in that kind of laboratory setting, right? And again, just to kind of sum it up, more importantly, we do have no way of knowing anything about many of those unknown situations where, again, officers had that legal authority to shoot and chose not to. Okay, it really is not a good comparison to simply look at the percentage of population figures when evaluating whether there is a racial component to a police officer's decision to shoot because the individuals involved do not occur randomly across the population. So, and this a lot of this is very important for us to remember. So, kind of keep going with this, and then I'll talk for a moment about this video. Most police killings involve individuals who are engaged in criminal or at least suspicious activity. In about 80% of all police shootings, the suspect is armed. And so you don't hear that in the media. Now, that doesn't mean that law enforcement is perfect. They have a long way to go, okay? But you do need to know the numbers. The most negative reports in the media describe truly horrible situations like the Walter Scott shooting. But these tragic incidents should not be basically conflated to represent all police shootings, because they really are not representative based on the numbers. Okay, so here is a really cool video. Take the time to watch it. This is a civil rights expert, and I've met this gentleman before, and he's a fabulous individual. And he had enough, I don't know what you want to call it, respect, understanding, open-mindedness, whatever word you want to put there, to go to a Arizona law enforcement agency and go through a series of shoot, don't shoot activities. And basically, not too long before he did this, he was marching in the street talking about officers that were shooting people indiscriminately, and that they should be fired and all this other kind of stuff, and they would be shooting unarmed people and all that stuff. And watch what happens to him when he goes through the same scenario. Okay, just a little tidbit, he does shoot a bunch of unarmed people. All right, so a lot of us are kind of wired very similarly, so, we do have to at least understand that. So watch the video. I think you'll really enjoy it from that aspect. And again, understand a lot of this data. This is a very debatable topic with different viewpoints, data and numbers, and it depends where you get your numbers from. Okay, so that really is important for all of us to know. Okay, so kind of finishing up, and we'll move on to use of force. So the decision to shoot is often made in a split second, sometimes in the heat of a struggle or in the presence of uncontrolled fear. And these are real situations, and officers should never fear being punished for using their weapon to protect themselves or others. Okay? But with that being said, we do understand that things do happen. Okay? And we do have to hold people accountable for that. So understand that. And then just to kind of finish this part up, here are two firearms. And not too long ago, there was a case that involved a 14-year-old that was shot by law enforcement because he had a toy gun. Okay? And basically, he reached for the toy gun. But when you look at these two guns, you tell me, which one is the toy and which one is the real one? These are the dilemmas the split-second dilemmas that law enforcement officers are up against, because if you guess wrong, you yourself will be killed. All right? So I just wanted you to understand that part. Now, that doesn't take away from wrongdoing that some law enforcement officers have been involved in. Okay? And that's really why we're talking about this subject. Okay. So let's, another case study just to kind of bring to mind as we talk about discretion and use of force in police shootings. Sometimes the cases, they're not straightforward, but a lot of people don't view it this way. So this is the case of Dante Wright, where the female officer intended to use her taser on a handcuffed prisoner to basically get him to comply. Actually, he was a struggling prisoner. I don't believe he was handcuffed. But anyway, he was struggling. She intended to use her taser. She actually yelled, "Taser, taser, taser," which is what you're trained to do. But instead of grabbing her taser, she mistakenly grabbed her firearm and shot and killed him. So, some people say, that, she should be arrested for murder, but did she really have the premeditated intent to kill him? Or was it just an ugly, ugly mistake? And that doesn't mean she shouldn't be held accountable. Okay? But these are the dilemmas. These are the issues. These are the training things. These are all those other things that come into play. And then another quick case study here, talking about Ma'Khia Bryant, a female attempting to stab another female. In the process of coming forward with the knife to stab her, you can see it right here, and she's getting ready to lunge forward and stab this person, and an officer shoots her, and everybody is demonizing the officer for doing that. So what would you have done? And again, I'm not playing either side of the fence. I'm going to sit right on the fence and let you think about it, because these are the complex dilemmas. Do you let the person stab and kill the person, and then the public says that you didn't do your job? Do you try to interfere by grabbing a hold of her? He didn't have time to pull out a taser. This was fluid and happening right away. So what do you do? Okay, interesting, right? Okay, so let's talk now about discretion and the use of force. So police have the uncontested right to use force when necessary to apprehend or subdue any suspect in a crime. They have the right to use lethal force, however, only if they believe that the suspect poses a threat to the officers or others. And the case that really kind of brings this together would be a case called Tennessee versus Garner in 1985, and I have a link to that case law as well. Now, when their use of force exceeds that, which is considered reasonably necessary to accomplish that lawful purpose, then it's deemed excessive or excessive force. And that is considered unethical and, of course, illegal. And the case law that outlines that would be Graham versus Connor in 1989. I have the link for that case law. But understand, again, it's very complex and it can be very controversial. So, and I know you've kind of learned some of, that it is complex and controversial. So Graham versus Connor was a United States Supreme Court case where the court determined that an objective reasonableness standard should apply to a civilian's claim that a law enforcement officer used excessive force in the course of making an arrest, an investigation type stop, or any other seizure of that person. But again, it can be very controversial. So, probably one of the most well-known use of force incidents in this country, of course, was that by law enforcement officers against Rodney King, revealed by the amateur video and widely disseminated. And this can still be seen on YouTube, even though the event occurred back in 1991. In this incident, the initial act of, passing a police vehicle and leading the officers on a chase to the involvement of about 12 police cars, a helicopter, and about 26, 27 officers. And the incident resulted in Mr. King being struck at least 56 times, with 11 skull fractures, a broken cheekbone, a fractured eye socket, a broken ankle, some missing teeth, kidney damage, and even a little bit of brain damage. And the King incident is quite an example of, lawful force or excessive force, depending upon one's perception, right? But, in my opinion, it was extremely excessive, and I think most people will say that, but not everybody is going to agree with that. So there you have it. Okay, so when we talk about discretion and use of force, and even factors in force and things like that, in 1994, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act was passed, requiring the Attorney General to basically compile data on the use of excessive force by law enforcement and publish that report every single year or annually. So that was kind of one thing. Now, the most important thing when we talk about factors of use of force to know is that excessive force occurs in less than 1% of the total encounters between police and citizens. And research also indicates that a small percentage of officers seem to be responsible for that disproportionate percentage of force, of use of force incidents. So that's kind of an interesting thing as well, right? Now, some studies do show an association between force and race or socioeconomic status, but other factors such as demeanor also seem to be influential. So one thing that's kind of been brought to light in a lot of different aspects when it comes to training, and officers now are training on de-escalation and things like that, would be that of compliance, meaning that if individuals would comply with the officer's instructions, etc., and not run, resist, fight, other things, then a lot of these type situations wouldn't happen, and that the citizen would still have the opportunity to file a complaint, file a lawsuit if they felt that their rights were violated or they were mistreated, etc. But again, these are just some of the studies, but they do talk about factors like demeanor is extremely influential. A Bureau of Statistics BGS study reported that force was used in about 1.6% of all citizen interactions. However, use of force seemed to vary depending upon the city. So that's kind of interesting, and it's also important to note that that figure describing use of force, describes use of force, not excessive force. Okay, it's just describing force used. Excessive force is really estimated to occur in a very minuscule portion of all total encounters with the public, estimated at 1/3 of 1%. So kind of keep that in mind. And here are some information from Friedrich's 1980 study, talking about some different aspects as it relate to factors in use of force. So first would be the characteristics of the target. So that seemed to be correlated with use of force, include race, sex, disrespectful demeanor, emotionality, mental illness, intoxication, perception of a weapon, the suspect's violent criminal record or the knowledge of that, the suspect's use of force, gang membership, or even socioeconomic status. And also situational characteristics, correlated with the number or with the use of force include the number of citizens present, meaning that positive association, the number of police officers present, positive association, and whether the encounter involved a car or a foot pursuit. And then finally, the characteristics of the officer involved in use of force, again, includes sex, age, and ethnicity. Psychological traits of the officer have been identified as well, including lack of empathy, antisocial, or paranoid tendencies, inability to learn from experience, a tendency not to take responsibility for your actions, or even cynicism. Okay, so these are just a couple of these different factors. And finally, just to kind of finish up with this section, it should be emphasized that these studies and the factors identified, again, are associated with the use of force, not necessarily excessive force. Excessive force is extremely minute, okay? And even though force is rare in terms of the percentage of times used of the total number of interactions between police and citizens, that does not mean that it's not a problem, right? In the past research, surveys of officers indicated that up to a quarter of the officers have at least some time or another used more force than necessary. But even one video, YouTube thing, whatever, of excessive force can poison the relationship between a police department and its community. So a lot of things for us to consider as we kind of move into the use of different devices now. Specifically, we're going to talk about the taser. So the taser is one type of conducted energy device, CED, if you will. But the word taser has come to be used in common language to refer to any CED. And the devices use electrical stimuli, if you will, to interfere with the body's nervous system, impairing the muscular control of the target. So it kind of like collapses your muscles, if you will. And it has been introduced with the hope that using it as an alternative to lethal force can save lives, right? And that's the rationale behind the taser. Now, generally, research indicates that CEDs seem to be associated with a decrease in the number of deaths of suspects, a decrease in the number of injuries to suspects, and a decrease in the number of injuries to officers. And that's good, right? Supporters allege that CEDs are safe in most cases, not all, and are potentially dangerous only when there is some underlying medical condition. Okay, so proponents of the taser, again, it's going to result in fewer injuries to officers and the suspects. It's going to reduce the need for lethal force. And it's safe in the vast majority of cases. And consider also that a police officer could be held liable when a CED is used on a person who poses no immediate threat. Okay, so someone that, that would be a force maybe above, what they could, if somebody's complying, why would you tase them, right? And departmental policies usually determine what is, for that agency, acceptable taser use. Now, the International Association of Police Chiefs recommends that you don't use a taser on juveniles per se, the elderly, anyone that's pregnant, and it should not be used repeatedly or by multiple officers. And other police groups promote guidelines, again, that prohibit the use of a taser when someone is merely verbally non-compliant, is handcuffed, or is intoxicated, or has a clear mental condition. So there's a lot of different variables. And typically, and what I have here is kind of the front page of the Rialto Police Department's taser guidelines, because all the departments have these different policies. Okay, so, and it tells you when and when you can't, or when you shouldn't, etc. So the guidelines are typically dictated by the organization. No different than when we talk about use of force, etc. Okay, so again, just kind of take note with a taser. You can look back to a case in December of 2009. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that a police officer could be held liable when a taser is used on a person who poses no immediate threat. So again, if they're just verbally non-compliant, you need to try. You could actually put your hands on them and move them to get them to be compliant, etc., versus tasing them. So again, that's where your policy comes into play. Okay. All right. So what about some responses to use of force? And again, I have a copy of the first page of the Rialto Police Department's policy on use of force. So there's a lot of policies in police work. So it is inevitable that police officers will need to use some level of force in response to non-compliant and resisting suspects, right, in their career especially. And in almost all cases, their actions are supported by the law and policy. Now, cases where officers' uses of force meet the definition of a crime are very, very rare. And in most cases of lethal and non-lethal use of force, officers are not indicted or charged. And again, you bring up this case here. Was it just a horrible mistake, or was there premeditation? This is the Dante Wright case where the female officer, instead of pulling her taser, pulled her handgun by mistake, okay, and shot the individual. So, these are all things for us to understand. Now, again, it is inevitable that officers will need to use some level of force in response to a person. Typically, in most uses of force incidents, officers are not indicted or charged because they meet the policy or guidelines. Civil suits are more likely than criminal. And officers may not be criminally charged, but understand they still might face discipline for violating some type of, policy. So it could be a civil lawsuit. Now, one reason, or the reasons, if you will, officers who are charged are usually acquitted is that juries have to decide, the same as they would with a regular suspect, beyond a reasonable doubt that the officer was not in fear for their life in order to find him or her guilty of a crime. Because if the officer basically thinks they're in fear for their life, they have the right to defend themselves, right? And so if the officer testifies that he or she was, in fear of imminent death or injury, it is difficult for the prosecutor to disprove that fear unless there's other proof that there was clearly no cause for fear. Thus, the advent of body cameras, right? And we're starting to see there have been a few additional charges against officers because it's been shown that, reasonably there may not have been that fear. Now, one would expect that most officers shoot only in those situations where they are legally justified. Therefore, there should be few, if any, prosecutions of police officers for use of force. However, some argue that prosecutors are unwilling to pursue charges against officers because of that close working relationship between prosecutors and police officers, or that police officers, cannot conduct such investigations fairly and objectively. And juries are also unlikely to believe that officers would use illegal force. So, again, but most of the time, civil suits are more likely to be successful than criminal prosecutions. And the reason is because the level of proof necessary to show liability it's lower. It's more of a preponderance of the evidence versus proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay. One thing just to kind of think about, all right, would be the fact of, one of the recent issues when officers have, they end up in a shooting, etc., or use of force, they're, the use of force is justified by their department policy, even by the district attorney's office on the first go round. But now they're going back and re-looking at some of these cases where they were actually viewed justified before, but now they want to go back and look at it again. And here's a case that I pulled up. Philly DA wants to retroactively change law to convict a police officer of murder. So in this case, he's actually trying to do an ex post facto law, change a law and have it retroactive. Well, that's illegal. You can't do that. But anyway, some district attorneys are actually looking at old cases that have already been disposed, if you will, and they've been ruled justified by the city, the board, whatever board looks at, use of force, and even the agency. So, and then finally understand too that officers may not be criminally charged, but they might still face discipline for violating policy. And the reason is that although an officer may have been compelled to utilize lethal or non-lethal force given the resistance or threat presented by the suspect, the officer may have created the situation by perhaps not attempting to de-escalate it, or may have violated policy by perhaps, let's say, maybe not waiting for a backup. That could be a policy. It typically isn't, but it could be, right? And these officers may be disciplined or even fired for that. Now, recently, the Department of Justice has also become more aggressive in investigating and identifying problematic use of force patterns in several cities. More than 20 cities have been the target of DOJ attention. And that's a very small percentage considering the amount of cities, but still, they've been looked at by DOJ. And a federal investigation typically ends up with either a judicially approved consent decree, and I'll tell you what that is, or a joint memorandum of agreement that basically details a range of changes that the department has to do. So basically, a consent decree is a legal agreement between the Justice Department and the police department, whereby the police department agrees to perform specific activities, submit to monitoring to ensure that that department meets the terms of the agreement, etc. LAPD went through a consent decree. They're not in it anymore. And here's kind of the first cover page on a consent decree. All right, so kind of moving on, and we're getting closer to being done. Recently, a small set of law enforcement officials have called for new approaches in training and a renewed emphasis on how to defuse situations to avoid the use of force. And it's been reported that 58 hours of training is given to recruits in the use of firearms, 49 hours in defensive tactics, but only 8 hours in de-escalation techniques. And de-escalation right now is kind of the big thing, everybody. Now, the Police Executive Research Forum, PERF, which I am a member of, comprised of former law enforcement officers, which I am, seeks to increase the training and emphasis on what they call de-escalation and presented a set of guidelines that include some of the following. And we'll take a look at those quickly. One would be prohibiting shooting into a moving car. 2 would be using those de-escalation strategies before using force. 3 would be abandoning the old 21-foot rule, and it's very controversial. Take the time and look it up if you want. It's called the 21-foot rule, and I'll let you kind of look that up. And then finally, administering first aid. So, immediately, meaning basically immediately even taking the shooter target to the hospital right away without waiting for an ambulance. So basically giving first aid to an individual, whether they're the suspect or not. Okay, these are all important things for us to kind of consider. And part of discretion also bleeds over into, criminal investigations. So how officers use discretion in their interactions with minority members and decisions to use force are the hot button topics of our time right now, right? However, discretion is an issue pervasive in all policing. So we're going to kind of focus now on issues related to what will be called proactive investigations and reactive investigations. In proactive investigations, police officers initiate investigations rather than simply respond. And there are many ways to conduct these investigations, ranging from what we call knock and talks, which is when you knock on someone's door and you talk to the person, etc., to sting operations, which are those kind of undercover operations, to buy bus, where you basically money passes, drugs pass, etc., and then there's a bust that takes place shortly after. And undercover operations, all of these types can be extremely complex. So, in proactive investigations, again, police officers initiate investigations rather than simply respond to crimes. We're talking about, drug distribution, pornography rings, stolen property. They all tend to be investigating a lot of times using undercover work. Prostitution, right? You do undercover work. Drug sales, manufacturing, transportation. Those are all undercover type things. Stolen property. Those are undercover. There's a lot of undercover work. And with that, okay, which is why we're talking about discretion here, deception comes into play. And deception is considered by police and the courts as a necessary part of police work when dealing with certain types of crimes and criminals. Because you can't really get close to some of them unless maybe you kind of deceive them a little bit, whether it's a sting operation or some other type of undercover type thing, right? So that's why deception is basically seen, as okay or part of police work when it comes to fighting certain types of crime. So part of proactive investigations would be, they attempt to document crime as it happens. It does require a more active police role. It often involves deception. It requires targeting groups, individuals, etc., based on reasonable suspicion. And it changes that police role from discovering who has committed a crime to discovering who might commit a crime. So again, we're a little bit more proactive in our efforts. Another kind of discretionary thing would be what they call asset forfeiture. And asset forfeiture laws allow agencies to confiscate and keep assets, typically money, associated with illegal enterprises. And, actions can be of cash as well as vehicles, houses, and other property. And there is increased scrutiny because of the possible profit motive that might be looked at by law enforcement. Because law enforcement, if they were to seize money, typically they can keep a percentage of that money and use it for certain things. Okay, certain crime fighting efforts like narcotics enforcement, some types of equipment, certain things that they can use that asset seizure money for. They can't use it for anything, but they do get to keep a percentage of it. And then what about informants? So informants, these are basically civilians. So these are individuals who are not police officers, but assist police by providing information about criminal, activity, right? And they are typically, they can be motivated by money, monetary profit, revenge, could be just a kick. It could be a need for attention. It could be repentance. It could be guilt, or even coercion, right? So there's a lot of reason that informants, kind of get involved in things like that. So we kind of have to understand what's their rationale for getting involved. And there are some ethical issues when it comes to informants as well, right? And again, kind of talking about why they might do it. They may inform on former associates to get back at them for things that they did wrong to them. They may cooperate with the police to get rid of criminal rivals. They may cooperate with the police because they're working off a case with the DA's office, and if they work this case, they can get their other case dismissed. So there's a lot of different rationales why these informants would do what they're going to do. So what are some ethical issues regarding informants? Well, becoming too intimate with informants, maybe overestimating the veracity of information provided, understanding that sometimes they lie, right? The potential for being duped or lied to by an informant, tricked, or using informants also to kind of entrap people, kind of like creating crimes. And we'll talk about what the definition of entrapment is in just a couple of minutes, because we got to kind of finish up. Engaging in unethical or illegal behaviors on behalf of the informant, letting the informant invade your personal life, even using coercion and intimidation to enforce a informant's cooperation. So there's a lot of things when it comes to informants. A couple of other quick things would be undercover officers. Again, when you do undercover operations, the operators, they deceive the suspects and others. And then sometimes working undercover, it can be very difficult for the officer and their family. Sometimes it's a short-term assignment. Sometimes it's a long one. Here's the cover of a book. And this is Bob Ladd. That's Tim Brennan. I work with these two gentlemen in Compton. And they're two very famous gang officers. So more to talk about on them. So again, undercover officers may pretend to be drug dealers, prostitutes, johns, delivery folks, and more. They must observe or even participate in illegal activity to protect their cover. There's sometimes a belief that the laws don't apply to undercover officers because of their assignments. And then sometimes the stress from undercover work, it really depends on the length of an assignment. There's damage to all when personal relationships are used kind of deceptively. In fact, some argue that an intimate relationship may take precedence over a concern for social well-being. Short-term UC assignments are a little bit easier. It's a weekend, it's a night, it's whatever. But those long-term undercover assignments could go for months. Sometimes if you're trying to work your way into a gang or something, it could be a year. So you can see how that can really impact the officer. We talked about entrapment. This is when an otherwise innocent person commits an illegal act because of, police encouragement or entitlement. A couple of quick cases, Sorrells versus United States and Sherman versus United States, specifically address entrapment. Okay, Sorrells, the fact that the government agents merely afford opportunities or facilitate the commission of the offense doesn't constitute entrapment. And Sherman basically says entrapment occurs when the criminal conduct was the product of the creative activity by police. So a lot of things to kind of think about. And then finally, reactive investigations. These are attempts to reconstruct a crime after it occurs. Consists of gathering evidence to identify and prosecute the offender. Investigators may develop early prejudice about the likely perpetrator, suspect, which might cause them to be tempted to engage in the noble cause corruption, right? The end justifies the means. Ignore or conceal evidence that contradicts what they believe happened. Maybe overstate existing evidence or alter evidence. So these are ethical issues as it relates to reactive. And then talk about investigations quickly. Again, interrogations. There's the Brown versus Mississippi case. There's the Moran versus Burbine case, talking about, when you interview someone, you can't use physical force. The courts basically employ what they call a shock the conscience standard. If what the officer does seems to be so egregious, that evidence will be excluded. Some techniques in deception would be calling an interview or an interrogation an interview, because those are two separate things. An interrogation is when you're asking specific questions, because you believe the person is the suspect. So you need to Mirandize that person because they're in custody. An interview might just be talking to the person about something. Negating the effectiveness of the Miranda warning, meaning not giving the Miranda warning, or misrepresenting the seriousness of the crime. All of these are techniques of deception. We talk about a few more: manipulative appeals to the suspect's conscience, maybe talking about religion or something like that. Leniency promises beyond your power. Hey, if you tell me this, I'll make sure the DA drops this. Interrogator misrepresenting their identity or using fabricated evidence. Again, all of these are different techniques of deception and ethical issues that we really need to pay attention to. Okay, so that last part went pretty quick, and we actually did go a little bit over, so I'm sorry, but there was just so much for us to cover. I wanted to make sure that we squeezed it all in. So with that being said, that's going to conclude part 2 of Chapter 6, Police Discretion and Dilemmas.